We've got a pretty brilliant move by the Colorado Supreme Court here. So you know by now that the Colorado Supreme Court has barred Donald Trump from appearing on the Republican primary ballot in that state, finding that he engaged in insurrection on January 6th and is therefore not eligible to serve as president. But it turns out that the Colorado Supreme Court did something expressly intended to bolster its own case when it inevitably reaches the U.S. Supreme Court, specifically with one of the Supreme Court's conservative justices. In 2012, Neil Gorsuch, who at that time was a circuit court judge, ruled on a case involving whether the then Colorado Secretary of State, Scott Gessler, remember that name, it's important, acted properly when he declared an independent candidate for president named Abdul Hassan was ineligible because he was born in Guyana, meaning he wasn't a natural-born citizen and therefore ineligible under the Constitution. Gorsuch found that Secretary of State Scott Gessler acted within his rights in keeping him off the ballot. That decision read, quote, "A state's legitimate interest in protecting the integrity and practical functioning of the political process permits it to exclude from the ballot candidates who are constitutionally prohibited from assuming office." Meaning in 2012, Neil Gorsuch recognized that the plain text of the Constitution includes certain prohibitions to being president, including being a natural-born citizen. The others, of course, being the age requirement of 35 years old and that you cannot have engaged in or given aid or comfort to those who've engaged in insurrection. And so just as a state has a, quote, legitimate interest in protecting the integrity and practical function of the political process, Neil Gorsuch's words, not mine, then a state can exclude candidates who are constitutionally prohibited from assuming office. Again, Neil Gorsuch's words, not mine. So if the U.S. Supreme Court is looking for the person who made this argument best, they don't have to look further than one of the sitting conservative justices, Neil Gorsuch. Also, and this is according to Business Insider, it's worth noting that one of Donald Trump's current lawyers is a guy named Scott Gessler, the former Colorado Secretary of State, whose office in 2012 kept Abdul Hassan off the ballot for president because he wasn't qualified based on the Constitution. In other words, Trump's attorney arguing that the Constitution shouldn't apply to Donald Trump is the same guy who himself undermined that very argument a decade ago, and whose actions were supported by Neil Gorsuch. These people are the living embodiment of the fact that this ruling by the Colorado Supreme Court should absolutely stand. With that said, I want to be clear-eyed about the fact that this case is going to be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that court has a very lopsided 6-3 composition in favor of conservatives, and that Donald Trump himself appointed a third of the entire bench. Beyond that, we've already watched as the U.S. Supreme Court's overturned past precedent, like with Roe v. Wade, for example, and that was despite repeated promises by the justices themselves during their confirmation hearings that nothing is more sacred than precedent, meaning their words don't actually mean much, and that now that they have power, they've shown a willingness to exercise it in a way that's most politically beneficial for them. With that said, here's where I draw hope. If the Supreme Court reverses the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling and decides that Trump can appear on the ballot, then it's effectively ignoring the plain text of the U.S. Constitution, and in doing so, placing Donald Trump above the Constitution. And that poses an existential threat to that very court. If they place Trump above the Constitution and Trump wins, he will essentially be a dictator, uninhibited by our laws or the Constitution, with the blessing of the highest court in the nation. And what does a dictator have no need for? A Supreme Court that acts as a check to his own power, meaning the Supreme Court could essentially be signing its own death warrant if it hands Trump the gift of unchecked power. I'm not sure that the Supreme Court, as partisan as it may be, is in the business of contracting its power away to other branches of government. And that's a point that my Legal Breakdown co-host Glenn Kirshner echoed during our most recent episode.
If they are going to rule that a president can attack the United States, can try to, in a very real sense, bring an end to American democracy, if they were to rule that that's good to go by them and by the Constitution, well, then Donald Trump maybe regains the reins of power, finishes the job. He is now a dictator. Let's call it what it is. And if there's one thing that a dictator has absolutely no interest in, it's a Supreme Court. So he would promptly, completely cut the legs out from under the Supreme Court. Heck, he might just try to disband the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has given him a green light as somebody who engaged in insurrection, tried to overthrow the government, who is again in charge of the very government he tried to overthrow.
And look, I want to be clear that while I'm a Democrat, I don't think we should just kick people off the ballots to help our own chances of winning. But that's not what's happened here. Trump has been found by a number of judges, Judge Carter in California, Judge Wallace in Colorado, and the Supreme Court in Colorado, to have engaged in insurrection. These decisions aren't made lightly, and they are based in evidence. So I get that Republicans want to frame this as election interference, but A, the Constitution is clear, and B, no one forced Donald Trump to do what he did. Inciting an insurrection was his decision. In fact, a number of the insurrectionists themselves admitted in court that they were there on his orders. So the notion that the responsibility falls on the shoulders of anyone but Donald Trump for the insurrection is completely devoid of logic. There's also some obvious irony in a political party that identifies itself as the self-proclaimed defenders of the Constitution that refuses to recognize the plain text of the Constitution simply because it doesn't redound to their political benefit. The Constitution is actually perfectly clear on this issue, and just because the result is perceived by Republicans as being catastrophic isn't a reason not to accept the plain text. Here's Mark Elias explaining exactly that point.
Yeah, and I think that's the right worry, Chris, but it starts not with what the people on the right are going to say, but it's what the people on the left are going to say. You know, the fact is the Alliance Clause was never that complicated. It was pretty straightforward. And too many people of goodwill, frankly, were willing to buy into a bit of a both sidesism and make it more complicated. And I think the same thing is happening here, frankly. The facts are very, very clear, and they have been found by, as Noah said, a trial court here and elsewhere, that Donald Trump incited a violent insurrection to overturn free and fair elections by preventing the certification of the Electoral College on January 6, 2021. That violates, on its plain terms, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in terms of making him ineligible to hold office. It's not complicated. It's not tricky.
Right.
It's not, it's not somehow nuanced or new ground. It's what the amendment says. And so we all have to start with being very, very comfortable with the fact that sometimes the Constitution yields small results when it's applied, and sometimes it yields profound results when it's applied. And in this instance, I agree, it yields a profound result, but that doesn't mean that we shrink away from the plain text.
So no, we don't get to only follow the Constitution sometimes, or only follow the Constitution for the small stuff. If we're going to be a nation of laws, as the Republicans purport to want to be, then we have to follow all of the laws, even if they're inconvenient for the GOP. So at this point, we have no choice but to wait and see what the U.S. Supreme Court decides to do. But regardless of whether they agree with the lower court or whether they reverse the lower court's decision, the fact that numerous judges have found as a matter of law that the leading Republican candidate for the presidency has incited an insurrection against our own government and should be disqualified based on the plain text of the Constitution should already be enough. It should already be enough of a deterrent for anyone in this country, left, right, or center, to recognize the unique danger posed by Donald Trump. Again, this isn't a left versus right thing. This is about the preservation of our democratic experiment. This goes beyond our opinions on taxation and the Second Amendment. This is about protecting our democracy or sliding full tilt into authoritarianism. This is not a democratic or progressive value. It is an American one. And the only way to keep it is to make sure that Donald Trump is nowhere near the levers of power as prescribed expressly in our Constitution. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on the screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.